Agastya, on his way to the office of the superintendent of police to pay Kumar for his train ticket to Delhi, past the ponds and buffalo, the crowds outside the collectorate is still waiting the wild cannabis. Kumar was in his office, breathing threats into some machine on his desk. Hein Bai Sen, your Englishman has left? Casual talk. You come for dinner sometime, Yar, and meet my wife. Agastya took out the 450 rupees. For the train ticket, sir. Kumar beamed and took from Agastya's hand one 100 rupee note. When you begin service, you don't get paid so well, Yar. I know. You cannot afford more than second class, so I'll take from you only the money for second class. His face added, What a darling I am. No? Then more small talk. Walking away from the police office, Agastya wasn't sure whether Kumar had been unnecessarily generous or incredibly base. Kumar would have sent a police menial to buy those tickets, and given his style of functioning, would not have paid the menial any money in advance. And after buying the tickets, the menial would not have had the guts to ask someone like Kumar for the money. If he was going to pay the menial 900 for 2 train tickets, he would hardly pay more than 300 for Agastya's ticket out of his own pocket. Perhaps Kumar would repay the menial with a favor, a desired posting, or the stoppage of a transfer, and had smoothly pocketed for himself Agastya's 100. In his place, smiled Agastya, I'd have taken much more. Maybe it was a sort of deposit towards future blue films, and he smiled again, anarchistically. This was certainly a scoop for the Dainik, especially since it was all conjecture. He thought about this for a while, but there was no way of getting the story to the Dainik without getting himself into a mess. He moved towards the collectorate. A few things to do there. Check for letters that the idiot peon Digambar might have missed. Collect his paycheck, and like a good officer, meet other officers, have tea, and waste time. Through the crowds, the incurious eyes, a few struggled to their feet to salam him, for they had seen him somewhere before, where they couldn't quite remember. But perhaps he was important, though he didn't look it, yet better to give him the benefit of doubt. Salams also from the peons in the corridor of the collectorate. Shrivistav hadn't arrived yet. Chidambaram wasn't in his hole either. He's gone to look for some car keys, said the bewildered clerk, substituting for Chidambaram, sweating with the strain of receiving phone calls for the collector. Agastya's smirk disappeared when he found out that his paycheck, for reasons unknown, hadn't yet arrived from the district treasury. The clerk was too delirious with the strain of doing another clerk's job to answer coherently his questions about his paycheck. He went to Joshi's room. Where he seemed to interrupt the second of the 6 or so tea breaks of the day. Life was a leisurely affair in Madna. Various aging fat men in the room, the denizens of the collectorate, who shuffled at seeing him and sat down demurely. Joshi beamed at him. The collector has lost his car keys, and waved his pale hands to suggest the consequent chaos. The district supply officer was there too. Agastya remembered him best from his first morning at the collectorate. He was still sweating, as though Shrivistav's shrieking months ago had permanently damaged his delicate metabolism. Agastya felt happy to see such placid faces. He sat beside the supply officer, who smelled like a scented eraser out of a geometry box, to possess which 16 years ago he and his school friends would have done just anything. Tea was served first to Joshi and then to Agastya. Silence, murmurs, clings, and slow contented slurps over saucers. Then the supply officer made 2 pans, the second one for Joshi. His fat hands moved slowly, with care and grace. He worked like an artisan on the pans. For him, time was not important. When he and Joshi pushed the pans into their mouths, they looked only at the inanimate, at tabletops, files, wall calendars. Tea in the RDC's room was a ritual, and Augustia was reluctant to disturb it. But Joshi, pan in mouth, an empty cup pushed to one side of the table, beamed at him again. So Augustia said, "Joshi-sab, my salary check hasn't arrived yet from the treasury. No one here seems to know why." Behind his spectacles, Joshi's eyes became orbs of concern. He picked up the intercom, his tongue maneuvering his pawn into some unobtrusive crevice. Some conversation, a clerk came in, entry legitimized by the files in his hand. Someone was dispatched to the treasury. Eventually Augustia was told that he'd get his check the following day. Then Joshi beamed again. Then more desultory conversation, and Augustia was shocked to hear that the monthly revenue officers' meeting was on the following day. When he left Joshi's room, certainly not for the district industry center to which he was attached that week, but for his room to Stone a few hours away, he was worried about the revenue officers' meeting. It would be slow death. He had survived 4 such meetings, but now felt too anarchic. The theft of the keys seemed to have liberated him. When he got into the jeep, he was saying to himself, approach the problems of the meeting as a problem in science, like those physics numericals in school that he had so enjoyed, and which had sent Prashant's and Drupal's pupils, frantic with ignorance, to the edges of their eyes, seeking out wisdom at other desks. Therefore, use against it logic and method, and you will also waste more time that way. He started laughing. The driver grinned in sheer sympathy, for he liked the sounds of happiness. The obvious course was to pretend to fall ill, but illness had its disadvantages, the most acute of which would be Shrivastov's visit, and Shrivastov might catch him masturbating or smoking a joint or both. Thus, to make out a strong case for illness, he would have to send for Dr. Multani. He smiled to himself. He was proceeding well. Yes, definitely logic and method. The jeep churned its way down the untarred road, making more noise than progress. He was again overwhelmed by the unsettling but exquisite feeling of the night before that rose out of concentrating all one's faculties on acts without reason, and he found all this much more enjoyable and challenging than the real life. He laughed again and hoped that the government of India would never find out just what kind of officer it was training in the district of Madna. And to Multani, of course, he'd say that his stomach was upset. But what if Multani asked him for a shit sample? That would be awkward, particularly since he'd been shitting so well of late. Or he could steal someone else's shit. Vasant's, perhaps, in whose case all he had to do was steal into the kitchen and delve into a vat. That would be quite a scoop for the Dainik. IAS officer caught stealing cook's condiments. Shankar's door was open and welcoming. No, he said to himself sternly, solve this meeting problem first. Yes, steps 1 and 2 were definitely illness and Multani. A fever, perhaps? He bolted his door and contemplated the rolling of a smoke. Then he checked himself. No, don't think of so many things at one time, and smiled at the checking. But many-branched and endless, Arjuna, are the thoughts of the man who lacks determination, he remembered, and started laughing again. He began the preparations of a joint. In school, an extremely popular myth had been that an onion in the armpit could bring on a fever. Some, like Prashant, had sworn by it. Bets! You have bets with me on this. But Agastya had never actually seen anyone with an onion in his armpit. Besides, he didn't want a fever at all. All he wanted was to bunk a meeting. Then he wondered if he should shave off his beard. Because if you are clean-shaven, he thought, you just have to stop shaving for 2 days to convince people that you are ill. Well, he'd have to settle for weakness then, and weakness that fell just short of a blood test. He smiled at the inch of ash on the joint that he had rolled. The ash leaned gracefully to one side, like Pisa's leaning tower, and from it a sinuous line of blue smoke. The ash was wrinkled and serrated. It could even have been human skin, infinitely creased by age and crumbling in winter, transformed by disease, leprosy, or any other of those horrors to which flesh is unwilling heir, into the desperate grayness. Finally, he decided that he would see Multani at his clinic that evening, for which visit Multani would be as pleased as a pimp, and consequently much more amenable to Augustia's suggestions of mystery behind his weakness. And at the clinic he could hint and hint until Multani invited him for dinner. Now that he had concluded his cogitations, he lay down on the bed in celebration. He smiled. It had been so taxing, approaching the problems of bunking a meeting armed only with logic and method. Stealing someone's car keys impetuously was just as effective, and so much easier. So it was no use, he smiled again, bringing to his existence some of that logic and method, always the softer option. He wondered if he should smoke again. In Delhi, Madan had lazily said, as though talking of a volcano in Colombia, that the police were getting stricter about smokers, that the best chance of escape when caught was to be caught by a constable who also smoked, and that the next session of Parliament was going to pass a really mean bill against people like Somaram. Somaram was Madan's old friend and favorite peddler in the Red Fort area. But, reasoned Augustia, it would be a long, long time, an eternity, before Madna would become Delhi. Later, laughing continually at his choice of phrases, he wrote a note for Digambar to take to Srivastav. Sir, I woke up this morning feeling extremely weak. I consulted Dr. Multani, who diagnosed the weakness as change of season exhaustion, and advised a few days' rest. Kindly excuse me from the revenue officers' meeting. I shall call on you at home as soon as I am well. He went to Dr. Multani's clinic after sundown. The address on the prescription read, Near Friends Chemists. At the bottom of the prescription was an advertisement 2 inches high. Come one, come all, to Friends Chemists. Like something out of Bangkok, thought Augustia, and Multani getting a percentage of the profits. He walked again through a madna with which he was not familiar. Friends Chemists was on the main market road, the corner shop of an alley. Multani was down the alley. The waiting room seemed to have spilled onto the wooden boards above the drain running along the alley. Dazed waiting room faces, waiting babies and tired mothers. He quite liked seeing other people looking depressed. Multani had hired some kind of gunda to be his receptionist. Red shirt with only the navel button tied, gold chain around his thick neck. The type smiled. Augustia, who behaves as though he's well hung. They all looked at Augustia. He didn't fit. I'm a friend of Dr. Multani, he told the gunda, wondering whether Multani had hired the gunda because he buggered well, mouthing filth and without lubricant or tenderness. He went through a wooden half door and past a smelly green curtain, laughing. Multani sat at a steel table peering into an adolescent's mouth which he abandoned when he saw Augustia. Much joy and handshaking, questions to which the answers didn't matter. Multani finally asked him to sit against one of the dirty pink walls beside a silent water cooler sufficiently large to accommodate a city of rats. I can't believe this is a social call, Sansab. No one calls on me unprofessionally, yet you look perfectly well. If you give me 20 minutes, I'll just finish my patients. Perhaps he means kill, thought Augustia. Then we can relax and chat. Multani beamed once more and returned to the adolescent's tonsils. The adolescent continued to stare at Augustia past Multani's round pink head. With his stretched jaws, he looked like a python momentarily distracted from devouring a piglet. Multani's room looked so awesomely depressing that he found it amusing. It was like a caricature of a shabby clinic, something out of a TV serial that desired to be realistic. A hospital bed, half hidden by a green hospital screen. Beside the bed, a large cupboard with ointment boxes and strips of pills oozing out of it like toothpaste out of a split tube. On the walls, calendars from pharmaceutical companies. One showed a woman in a sari laughing while running beside a tonga, from which all her friends were looking down at her and laughing back. The company, Augustia read, made beltless sanitary napkins. They remain in place, Prashant had maintained in the last years of his life, because of the stickiness of puss juice. Bets? Between patients, Multani sent the Gunda for tea and a thumbs up and asked Agastya questions, giving him lots of time to plan his lies. Multani looked so pink and positive that he decided he'd get dirty with him when they were alone just to see how he would react. He wondered what it would be like to be a doctor in a small town and come to a room like this every day and look into people's mouths and breathe in their exhalations. So what if you earned 8,000 rupees a month for it? He thought, as Multani surely did. Surely what was far more important was the quality of your life. He stopped there because the argument against him was the contentment on Multani's face. Well, to each his own then, he concluded dissatisfiedly. Multani took less than 2 minutes per patient, some with a bashful half smile at Agastya. He took to the bed behind the screen. He took 5 rupees per sucker and directed them all to friends' chemists. A staccato conversation with Agastya all the while. Then the last man, tall and thin, about Agastya's age, looking almost tuberculosis with exhaustion. He sat down opposite Multani and began coughing almost immediately, and Agastya instinctively stopped inhaling, another old habit of his to stop breathing whenever anyone around him coughed. But the man wasn't a patient but a salesman. He took out tubes of ointment and strips of pills from his sad plastic briefcase and displayed them to Multani, mumbling all the while about the virtues of various maxes and mycins. The salesman had buck teeth. He remembered after the first rains in Madna he had seen Shankar's wife, but she had bared only her canines and had looked predatory. But the salesman's lips wouldn't quite meet over his incisors, and he looked just a loser. Multani acted tough, with an occasional sly side glance at Agastya. Yes, he'd see about this pill and that tablet. The salesman sweated in anticipation of being effusive in his gratitude, but retained his fixed smile. Could he take a few orders? No, not now, not now, said Multani. The salesman's eyes didn't move from Multani, Agastya's age, but he came from the hinterland or the unfamiliar Madna beyond the offices. He vaguely wondered what a salesman's day would be like. Perhaps just moving from one Multani to another, groveling for orders. But after the contentment on Multani's face, he was now reluctant to prejudge and dismiss other lives. But equally true that, as the salesman talked, he looked almost feverish with unhappiness. Maybe, thought Agastya, he was ambitious and just not satisfying himself. Perhaps he wanted to do much better and make enough money to set up some small business or something. Even the salesman must have concrete plans and a defined future, and happiness for him perhaps would be a clear matter of either getting more money or not getting it. The salesman was so intense with his fixed smile, a Dale Carnegie type, that Multani seemed to be wilting. He wondered what the salesman would think of him, Agastya. Would probably just sneer, might even be envious. Would say a soft success story, the son of a governor, Anglicized and megapolitan, now in the Indian Administrative Service. All you have to do is recline and fart to earn your money. And then if Agastya told him, I want to resign because I feel restless, he was suddenly ashamed of himself, looking at the salesman. talking about medicines for 12 hours a day. His restlessness seemed awfully frivolous. The salesman made him feel both eerie and guilty. Be happy you're not him, and how dare you behave so cheaply when you have the chance not to be him? Then Multani was through and over his thumbs up, beaming only at him. Augustia took long to describe the symptoms of his weakness and then added, I also have a rash in an embarrassing place. Multani stopped beaming, began instead to look reassuring, asked him to lie down, and checked him out, throat, pulse, stomach. To Augustia on the bed, Multani's face above him looked grotesque. His cheeks sagged, looked like shaved buttocks, as though gravity was inexorably pulling his flesh down. You seem all right, said Multani, puzzled, and then demurely. Perhaps your rash. Augustia immediately took off his pants and lay down, eyes closed and left leg bent. Like he laughed silently, a Caucasian pin-up girl, suntanning herself on some alien beach. He laughed even more when his nostrils caught the faint stench of smegma. Multani didn't go too close, murmured. There doesn't seem to be anything, and gave him an ointment, a tonic, and some vitamin pills, all from the overflowing cupboard, left behind by other intrepid despite defeat salesmen. Augustia immediately checked the alcohol content of the tonic. Good, 14%. Then the usual doctor talk. Nothing really wrong with you. You must sleep and eat well. Your insomnia. Oh, eat well. I can't. And he smiled bravely. Eat well while I'm staying at the rest house. 2 minutes of that, and Multani had invited him for dinner. He said yes, thank you immediately, and asked, perhaps I should just rest for a few days. No, until the season stops changing? Yes, of course, said Multani, a little absent-mindedly, perhaps startled by the immediacy of Augustia's acceptance or by his diagnosis. I'll just slip across to Friend's Chemist's and phone home that I'm bringing a friend along. Just 2 minutes. On the way out, he asked his gunda to get Augustia another tea. Augustia wandered around the 10-by-10 hole of a room, cupboard to hospital bed to steel table to cooler, wondering if he should steal anything. But there was nothing interesting except the money in the drawer, and Multani had probably counted that. Multani's scooter was new and of some off-white shade indeterminable in the dark. They watched the gunda lock up the clinic. Augustia was startled to discover that Multani rode his scooter in an insanely reckless manner, but Multani's face displayed no consciousness of this as he turned to him quite often in the course of an incomprehensible monologue that lasted the entire journey. Augustia could only shut his eyes and succumb to the strange excitement of a fortuitous throw of a die with death. Again the chance to burst into fragments of flesh. Again that perception of an ultimate release, the profoundest renunciation of one's own sentience, almost sensual in its bliss, that even one's death need not be one's own act. The scooter raced through the alleys of the town. On his eyelids flashes of the passing lights and Multani's hair oil scent in his nostrils. His was the generation, his father had said, that didn't oil its hair. Multani stayed above a malodorous drain in a dark alley, or so it seemed. The scooter stopped outside a wall of blue wood. Multani knocked on it, and a part of it opened inwards. Accommodation is a big problem in Madna. Multani began apologizing while ushering him in. I pay 500 rupees rent for this hovel. The wooden box was really an enclosed veranda and Multani's drawing room, with quite a few people in it. Sensab, please meet my father, my children, Vinod and Apsara. Say hello to Uncle Children. They didn't, and instead disappeared into the folds of their mother's sari, from where they peeked at him, trying to look cute. My wife, and this is Dr. Ghoshal. He works in the civil hospital. The usual embarrassed pause, then, "Do sit down, Mr. Sen," said Multani's father. "As Darshan says, accommodation is a big problem here, but that ought not to prevent us from sitting down." Everyone laughed, and Agastya was surprised. He never expected any wit from old men, or rather, anything that he himself would call wit. Humor, unlike the sense of dislocation, was just too generational. Pultakaku, for instance, was supposed to have been some killer joker in his time, and when the entire clan congregated in Calcutta on rare pujas, the aunts would still drift towards him and shriek with teeth-gritting laughter at any emission from his mouth. But Agastya remembered smiling, and only smiling, at only 2 lines of his in 24 years. Conversely, nothing that he ever said to raise a laugh ever did so with his father, Pultakaku, or his aunts. But he smiled at Multani's father. "Please, don't call me Mr. Sen, sir. Agastya is better." Probably senile, he would have said it if asked to describe the old man. Watches TV all the while, even when it's off, belches very loudly, takes very long in the toilet, spends much of Multani's money on his medicines, is terrified of death. From Delhi, he had told his father over the phone, "Manik Kaku is looking more and more like a skeleton. Maybe his granddaughter looks the same. Why doesn't he sell himself to a biology lab?" In his next letter, his father had abruptly, without alluding to anything in any way, almost in the fashion of Marcus A., had talked of old age, but in a very sort of Indian way, of the obligation upon the young of revering it, if necessary, only because it was old age, because the old need reassurance in the guise of respect more than the young. And there was evidence to support Agastya's dismissive summary of Multani's father, for TV hadn't yet arrived in Madna. So the father had been listening to the radio, a question and answer program on diabetes, and sometimes his head did shake involuntarily. "Agastya, a good name, an unusual name. Of course you have no idea what it means," said Multani's father. Agastya had told his father once that it was best to be very young or very old, because then you could say marvelously rude things with no repercussions, and no one took you seriously, so you were ready for perfect irresponsibility. And between the two, it was much better to be very old, because if you were very young, then you were also obliged to be cute. Of course, his father hadn't laughed. Before Agastya could say, "About half an hour ago, I stripped in front of your son so that I could show him my loins," the father said, "Agam is mountain." Agastya could be Agam plus Asyati, one who pushes a mountain, or Agam plus Istayati, one who stops a mountain. We often have this ambiguity and uncertainty about our names, their origins. It should also be linked to the Latin agius, which means to advance. That is appropriate since the sage Agastya was also the wanderer who pined for Benares, a good name. And for some of us, names still matter, but for how long, I don't know. Then Dr. Ghoshal intervened. "A very Bengali choice of a name. Bengalis are very fond of lovely names. Take my own, Shayamalendu." No one did. Dr. Ghoshal was indeed very Bengali himself, tall and thin, but with a large belly, fingers yellowed by nicotine and fish curry, bespectacled, large yellow teeth, black hair combed straight back. Agastya wondered what he and Multani had in common, apart from their profession. Like other Bengalis who elect to settle outside Bengal, Dr. Ghoshal blamed Calcutta for not preventing him from doing so. But Calcutta has life, he conceded. At that, Multani's father, without saying a word, turned the radio on very loud. This, it was now the Hindi news read at slow speed, prevented all conversation. Then Dr. and Mrs. Multani returned from the bowels of the house. He, in kurta and pajamas, very firmly switched the radio off and looked around with a "so everybody enjoying yourselves" smile. Small talk, shy questions about Augustia's father, they trying to put him at ease, convinced that he needed easing, and he delighting in being perverse and squirming and looking more and more uncomfortable, fingering them in short. Dr. Ghoshal stuffing snuff into his nostrils, breathing noisily through his mouth and hypnotically intoning the name of other Bengalis in high places. Ambassadors and secretaries to the government of India tempting Augustia to disturb him with, "I want to resign, fuck a gin, smoke marijuana, read Marcus Aurelius in the sun," to watch his face for the incomprehension at each one of those acts. Suddenly old Mr. Multani interrupted them with, "Mr. Sen, do you know Bengali? Fluently?" The question made Multani, his wife, and Ghoshal look at one another surreptitiously. The old man, face almost belligerent, stared determinedly at Augustia. "Why, yes." The old man stared some more, then nodded. "I'm very surprised." But his tone said, "You are lying, of course." He continued, "Darshan only speaks Hindi, and to me it seems that no one born after partition cares." Multani smiled bashfully, "And then sometimes I think that these things don't matter. I left so much behind in Lahore when I came to settle in Madna after 1947, and here I had to struggle to send Darshan to study medicine at Indore." Old Mr. Multani spoke slowly but with a kind of intensity, as though determined to talk even though he suspected that if no one interrupted him, it would only be in deference to his age, and perhaps because no one was listening. "I watched him grow." Multani looked both bored and embarrassed. Certainly he had heard all this before. Perhaps his father, with the one kind of single-mindedness of age, spoke of little else. But he didn't see why his father should bore a stranger. "And I thought my son has seen nothing. It is good. He has not seen the British. He has not seen the riots of partition. My entire generation suffered. Some time ago there was a riot here in Madna, too. But compared to the 40s, those riots are like firecrackers. Hoodlums having their special brand of fun and organizing integration meetings. You, for instance, Mr. Sen, have never seen Hindus and Muslims at war." Of course he hadn't. In his second college year, there had been riots in Old Delhi, and the university had closed down. They had immediately gone onto a bus for Manali to get something good to smoke and waste time with the hippie CIA agents. And on their way out of Delhi, Drupo had complained against the Muslims. "Why can't they scream more effectively against the hypocritical secularism of India? If Sunday can be a holiday to please the Christians, then they should demand that Friday be a holiday too for them. Then we'll have a 4-day week, see?" The riot had been 6 kilometers away. "Darshan is lucky. I would think he has not been a refugee like me. Wanderers clutching only our pasts. We had nothing else. But then, what we have lived through, though it was awful, it was almost momentous, and sometimes I feel that it is much worse to be the generation after." The old man exhibited an irrational pride, a kind of anachronistic nationalism. He droned on about the terrors of partition. Ghoshal asked Agastya in a loud undertone when he thought Calcutta's underground would be completed, "Your generation has missed the most dramatically significant years, the first 5 decades of our century." But nationalism and those 50 years had also passed Madna by. thought Agastya. So he had sensed many afternoons ago when he had seen, with Sati, an eternally somnolent town from a bridge. Multani's father had known the sufferance of colonial rule, but Agastya and Darshan Multani had not, and unlike John Avery, had not even been particularly inquisitive. Patriotism and its bloodletting had simply bypassed Madna. In his letters home, Richard Avery had testified to that. And Agastya had just been born too late. He felt strange, both deprived and curious. What must it have been like to wander the streets of Calcutta and not to be allowed entry into the Calcutta Club? Natives keep out. And they have left behind cultural cripples incapable of appreciation, so I used to think, but now I am not so sure because there is no fault anywhere. Your generation is what it is, just like the English we speak. It is inevitable. That is why I was surprised at your name and your knowledge of Bengali. I did not expect it. But just then, Mrs. Multani tactfully suggested that they should eat, and they all moved towards the bowels. Vegetarian food, but excellent, and Agastya gorged. The old man said little, but Ghoshal and Multani probed continually. Agastya's background, the civil services examination, the nature of his job, his reactions to Madna, his marriage plans, his other interests. At 11, he said thank you and I hope we shall meet again to everybody and sat down behind Multani for another dangerous ride. They stopped at a cigarette shop. The town hadn't slept yet. They had pans and Multani a cigarette. I don't smoke in front of my father, said Multani sweetly. Agastya noticed that he didn't inhale.